growth rate. Its international reserves were increasing very rapidly. So if you just look at this little period here for about a year before the crisis, so here's the crisis on this side. This period before the crisis, Indonesia was experiencing a very rapid increase in its international reserves. And that's precisely the opposite of what was happening in Thailand. Indonesia at that time had quite low inflation. It was around about 5%. That's not brilliant, but it was better than it had been previously, which was closer to 10%. The budget was under control. Indonesia has always had this balanced budget inclination, and the budget wasn't under any stress at that time. There was a lot of foreign borrowing going on at that time, and that was encouraged by the differential in interest rates. Interest rates in Indonesia were quite high relative to interest rates offshore. Of course, if you borrow offshore, or if you borrow in dollars, there is an exchange rate risk, but people were encouraged by the fact that the rate of depreciation of the rupiah was quite slow over a long period of time, about 3 to 5% per annum. So even if you built in this exchange rate loss, the interest rate differential was still big enough to make it very profitable to borrow overseas, to borrow in foreign currencies. Now, what happened when Thailand had its crisis and had to devalue something? Well, international investors suddenly became very nervous. Basically, they thought, well, we're investing in Southeast Asia. We thought we knew what we were doing, but it seems in the case of Thailand, we didn't know what we were doing. Maybe the same is true about Indonesia. So they became nervous and they started trying to withdraw their exposure to Indonesia. Now, it's important to understand that it's not only investors who are invested in Indonesia who are interested in getting capital out of the country. It's also an opportunity for people to profit from speculation. So it doesn't matter if you had an exposure to Indonesia previously. If everybody thinks that there's going to be an devaluation of the rupiah, then everybody has an incentive to speculate against the rupiah. So indeed, the rupiah was floated pretty much unexpectedly on the 14th of August in 1997. There wasn't any warning of this, there wasn't any discussion of it beforehand, just suddenly the decision was announced. Most people actually thought this was a reasonable decision at the time, but the implications of this decision were not well understood. In my view, monetary policy requires a strong commitment to one and only one nominal anchor. What do I mean by nominal anchor? I mean one of three things: either the money supply, or the price level, or the inflation rate, or the exchange rate, or the rate of depreciation. Good monetary policy means making a strong commitment to one of those three things. Well, in the 10 years or so prior to the Asian financial crisis, the actual nominal anchor had been the steady rate of depreciation of the rupiah. So if we have a look at the exchange rate, actually this graph, the title is wrong. It shouldn't be the exchange rate, it should be the rate of depreciation. So the rate of change in the exchange rate. So it looks kind of volatile, but if you look carefully at this, the rate of depreciation is pretty much within the range 3 to 5%. And this is over a long period of time. I guess this goes from about, the graph goes from 1988 to 1997. So it's about a whole decade. People had got used to the fact that the rupiah would depreciate around about 4% per annum. So that was what was actually the nominal anchor for monetary policy at that time. nobody actually said this in practice. You'll never find the central bank saying at the time, oh, we have a nominal anchor and it's the rate of depreciation. But de facto, in reality, that's what it was. So after they floated the rupiah, then suddenly that nominal anchor is gone. That's okay, but you need to replace it with something else. But in fact, they didn't do so. There was no anchor, there was no nominal anchor for monetary policy. And because there was no anchor, it's like having a boat in a fast-flowing river. It just gets swept away. And that's what happened in Indonesia. The money supply ran out of control. As a result of that, the inflation rate went up very rapidly. And because people are interested in the real interest rate, then nominal interest rates had to rise very rapidly. And of course the rupiah itself depreciated wildly at that time. So we're talking about now about September of 1997. The authorities here had failed to stabilise the macroeconomy, and so the government turned to the IMF for assistance in about October of 1997. The IMF put together a rescue package. It was always said that this was $43 billion. In reality, it was a lot smaller than that. But if you ask yourself the question, well, why did Indonesia need $43 billion? It didn't, because remember the budget was well managed. There's no pressing need for funds for the budget. So actually this was basically an attempt to bluff investors and speculators by boosting Indonesia's gross reserves. It was saying, you want to fight with me? I've got $43 billion, you know? You think you can fight with me when I've got $43 billion to play with? Well, okay, that worked for a short period of time, but it really doesn't work in the end. My interpretation of what went on is that the private sector, in other words, the domestic and the international investment community, guessed that Bank Indonesia simply didn't understand what was going on. And I think it was right, because Bank Indonesia subsequently ran a highly expansionary monetary policy. And if you do that, you're basically guaranteeing that there's going to be a depreciation of the currency, and that's precisely what the private sector was expecting. So that highly expansionary monetary policy was utterly incompatible with exchange rate stability. So one of the lessons we have to learn from that period is that Bank Indonesia had conflicting roles. And this conflict was not really recognized. It was the conflict between the central bank acting as the lender of last resort to try to keep the banking system going, and its role as the monetary policy maker. So this is the way it all played out. First of all, there were a lot of firms that were in trouble because they had borrowed in dollars, and now they found, because of the exchange rate depreciation, their debts in rupiah terms were getting much bigger. That meant that the banks that had lent to them, obviously there's a lot of that lending occurring in Indonesia in dollars, that meant that the banks were then in trouble because their borrowers were not going to be able to repay. So one of the first things that happened as a result of the IMF program is that 16 small banks were closed at the end of October of 1997. Now this created a problem. The government said at the time, you don't have to worry about all the other banks, they're okay. But nobody really believed that. And so people started shifting their deposits from private banks to the state banks and to foreign banks, because the state banks and the foreign banks were regarded as safe. The private banks, the domestic private banks, were not considered to be safe. So that meant that suddenly the private banks had a great liquidity problem, and the state and the foreign banks became highly liquid. There was a big shift of base money from the private banks to the state and foreign banks. But Bank Indonesia, of course, was focusing on this, the private banks becoming illiquid. And so Bank Indonesia then had to act as the lender of last resort. And when the central bank lends to banks, it's injecting base money into the system, and that increases the money supply. So this graph is a little bit complicated, but focus on the red line here. The red line is base money growth, the growth of base money. It's not actually the growth of base money, it's the actual absolute amount of base money. So if we start from here at the beginning of November, this is when the first IMF package began to be put into operation. And then we skip forward to, it's about 8 months or so, to July of 1998. The supply of base money doubled during that period. Look at it here, let's say it's 35 trillion there. Look at it here, it's about 70 trillion. So this is a phenomenal rate of growth of the supply of base money in that very short period, doubling in 8 months. So Bank Indonesia didn't make any serious attempt to sterilize this. It could have sterilized that, in other words, it could have offset the increase in base money by borrowing from the state banks, because remember, the state banks have now got a whole lot of money because it's been transferred across from the private sector banks. So they would have been happy to purchase SBIs at that time, but Bank Indonesia didn't think of that. And the interesting thing about what was going on is that we've got a banking crisis, we've got the beginnings of an economic crisis, and what we expect in those circumstances is that banks kind of close their doors. They don't want to do any business, they just want to sit there and consolidate. Malahan, in Indonesia at that time, the banks started lending on a grand scale. They weren't cutting back their lending, they were increasing rapidly. Just have a look at this. Certainly they did close down for a little while here. That's only a period of about 2 months. But from about the end of 1997, they started lending in rupiah really quite rapidly. It's quite a big increase going on at that time. So that's just not what you expect to see in the middle of a crisis. And people like to talk of there being a bank run at that time. In other words, people worried about the banks and so they're withdrawing their deposits. Well, it wasn't really a bank run at all. It was a run on the currency, and the run on the currency was financed by the central bank itself. Let's have a look at what was happening to bank deposits at that time. The red line at the bottom here is demand deposits, and you can see there was no reduction in the amount of demand deposits at all during this major period of the crisis. In fact, demand deposits were increasing steadily. The same is true of savings deposits, that's the green line. They were increasing steadily during this crisis. The only thing that happened was there was quite a mild reduction in deposito jangka, time deposits, but really they were fairly stable over this whole period, and by February of 1998 they were back to the level they had been at the beginning of the IMF package, and then beyond that they were increasing, they weren't decreasing. So if anybody tells you there was a run on the banks or the banking system as a whole, that's not correct. There were runs on certain banks, but not in aggregate. So here's my interpretation of some aspects of the crisis. Often people say that the high inflation at the time was caused by the depreciation. I say that's wrong. I say that both inflation and depreciation were caused by the excessive money supply growth at that time. What happens if the supply of money grows very rapidly? When you get an excess supply of money, think of yourself just from an individual point of view. What do you do if you've got an excess supply of money? Well, you go and buy things. The way to get rid of an excess supply of money is to buy things. So you can buy two sorts of things. You can buy goods and services, which causes inflation, or you can buy foreign exchange, which causes depreciation. Both of those things happen. Both had the same cause, namely the excessive growth of the supply of base money that occurred at the time, and that in turn was caused by Bank Indonesia lending a lot of base money to the banking system. So instead of the first IMF package stabilising the situation, the crisis just became worse and worse. So by January of 1998, the economy was rapidly heading into recession, and as you all know, in 1998 the GDP fell by about 13 or 14%. It's a huge recession or even depression in Indonesia in that year. The price of foreign exchange, in other words the exchange rate, had increased by more than 4 times. So this is what the exchange rate looked like. Rupee was floated back here in August. It's a little bit of a jump, but not too much action down here. At the beginning of the IMF package, there was a little bit of a strengthening, but it didn't last more than a few days. There was a problem here that there were concerns about Suharto's health at the beginning of December. But then, this is what happened in January. We've got this huge depreciation. So you've gone from an exchange rate of about 2,500 to about 10,000. So things went from bad to worse. So if the first package didn't work, then we have to come along with a second package. There was a second package in the middle of January of that year. Again, you got a temporary strengthening, but within a few weeks, it's gone crazy again. So at that time, inflation was spiraling out of control. This is what the consumer price index looked like. You get to the end of the year, the rate of inflation is about 10%, but then it just shoots up until it actually peaked above 80%. About September of '98. So as I say, the first letter of intent, the first IMF package clearly didn't work, and so there had to be a second one. And this photograph is very famous. We've got the boss of the IMF, Michelle Kambusu, sitting there like a school teacher looking at a naughty pupil. Suharto is signing and saying, "Yes sir, I'll do that sir." Now it seems to me it's important to understand Suharto's response. Suharto, like him or loathe him, it seems to me he was always development oriented, and he was very successful in being development oriented. So the Indonesian economy had made outstanding progress over a period of 3 decades or more while he was in power. So he has presided over this long period of economic success, and then suddenly that success has come to a halt, and Indonesia's economy is going backwards very rapidly. And so obviously we're going to be talking about Steve Henke here, and Henke was later to say, Suharto fretted, worried about inflation because he was worried that this would ignite with the rupiah collapsing, and this is a quote from Suharto, they'll riot in the streets, the rakyat will get out on the streets and riot. I'll have to bring in the military, and it could potentially get quite bloody. So clearly, Suharto was very, very concerned about what was happening. And from his point of view, the technocrats, people like, I guess, Ujoyo and Alimarana and so on, and their advisors and the IMF, had persuaded Suharto to give way on many of the microeconomic policies that existed at the time. And some of these were kind of famous, you know, like the MOBNAS, the Mobile Nacional. Everybody knew that that was a policy to help Tommy Suharto. It was the clove monopoly also from Tommy Suharto. But there were many policies that existed at the time. They had nothing to do with the crisis, and yet in this IMF package, Suharto had to agree to get rid of all those policies. He had to agree to privatize state enterprises. He had to agree to this and to agree to that. Most of those things were important to Suharto because, quite frankly, they benefited his first family, and his cronies. But they had nothing to do with the crisis. So Suharto kind of agrees to all of this stuff, and yet clearly the IMF program didn't succeed in stabilizing the economy. So if you're Suharto, you think, wow, I'm giving away so much, I'm getting nothing back. The economy is not stabilizing. If the economy does not stabilize, then everything is rusak, everything is kacau. I'm dead, I'm in pretty big trouble. So put yourself in Suharto's position. If you do a little bit of research about this, you can find that other countries around about that time previously had currency crises, and they had dealt with their currency crises by setting up currency board type systems. There are examples of countries that have had crises, and they have solved those crises by adopting a currency board system. So if you're Suharto, it's natural to ask the question, why don't we do that? So that, I think, is exactly what happened. It's very understandable in those circumstances that Suharto felt he was getting bad advice from his technocrat advisors, he's getting bad advisors from the IMF, bad advice from the World Bank, and so, okay, I'll go and look for advice somewhere else. So he went looking for Steve Hanke, Professor Steve Hanke from Johns Hopkins University in the United States. Why? Because Steve Hanke had been instrumental in setting up currency board systems in some of these other countries, and those systems have been quite successful. So here's where we would all like to be, sitting at Tindana, having a chat with number one. Not very many foreign advisors who ever got to talk face to face with Suharto. Most of the people from the IMF, the World Bank, Harvard and so on, they get to advise through the technocrats, but not talk face to face to Suharto himself. So Suharto was interested enough in the currency board proposal that he invited Steve Hanke into his home several days running. So let's talk about this currency board idea. A currency board is simply an alternative to central bank for managing monetary affairs. Two different ways to do the same thing. Government has to manage its monetary affairs. On the one hand, what we usually do these days is to use a central bank, but an alternative institution is a currency board. And actually the currency board is not a new idea. It's the central bank that's the new idea. Because if you go back several decades, you find lots of currency boards in the world, and the tendency has to go away from the currency board in favour of the central bank. It's been a phenomenon in the post-World War II era. The rationale for a currency board is that they do not allow any discretion in monetary policy. The central banks have all the discretion in the world, and very often that works out badly. So let's take away the discretion, let's just have an institution that works automatically, and let's see what results from that. Because it's precisely the discretion available to the central bank that has often led them to generate inferior outcomes. And Hankey has actually done quite a lot of research on the relative performance of economies that have a central bank compared with economies that have a currency board. And according to him, there's evidence to suggest that the countries that have a currency board actually have better growth over time on average, and they have lower inflation over time on average. Let me just interrupt myself here. This presentation is actually based on a paper that I have written, and I've given Smearle a link to that paper. I don't know if you've publicized that, but remind me later if we forget. I can give you the link to the whole paper so you can read this in great detail if you wish to do so. Going back to the presentation now. You remember one of the things that I said at the beginning is that the central bank, monetary policy management, needs to have one nominal anchor. Not two or more, but it must have one. Now, one of the problems with central banks is that they don't seem to realize that it's actually impossible in the long run to control two things, such as both domestic prices and the exchange rate. You can control one, but in the long run you cannot control both of them. And if you think of it, sometimes we hear people say, oh, Bank Indonesia has to control the real exchange rate. No, you can't do that. The real exchange rate is basically some kind of variable which has nominal prices in the the exchange rate in the numerator and nominal prices in the denominator. So the real exchange rate is two things, but Bank Indonesia really only has one instrument. So it cannot control both of those. That's why you can't have two nominal anchors, you can only have one. This is actually the reason why Indonesia fails chronically to control its inflation. Remember I said a while back that the actual nominal anchor for monetary policy in Indonesia was the nominal exchange rate. For the last 10 years, for the 10 years prior to the crisis, the nominal exchange rate depreciated steadily at about 4% per annum. And for that reason, because Bank Indonesia was causing that rate of depreciation, that was the reason why the inflation rate was always above target. The preferred inflation rate was about 5%, but in fact it was always about 10%. That's because you can't control both of those things at the same time. Okay, let me just explain what a currency board is. It's a very, very simple financial institution. It's a much more simple financial institution than the central bank because it really only has one kind of asset and two kinds of liability. By far the bulk of its assets are foreign exchange reserves. Bank Indonesia, the central bank has that of course, but it has a lot of other assets. And the major liability is base money, the monetary liabilities of the central currency board. Right? Remember, base money is notes and coin in circulation and possibly deposits of the banking system with the central bank or the currency board. But let's just say, for simplicity, that it's notes and coin. The only other liability is equity. So that's what, in principle, simplistic form, that's what a currency board balance sheet looks like. You'll notice that the foreign exchange reserves are a bit higher than base money. Okay? because there is equity in there. So what does the currency board do? It doesn't do very much at all. In fact, it only does one thing. It buys and sells foreign exchange. In other words, it issues and redeems base money in return for foreign exchange. If you're an exporter, or if you borrow overseas, you've got some dollars, you can go along to the currency board and you can say, here are some dollars, I would like you to have these, I would like you to give me the corresponding amount of rupiah base money. And the currency board will do that for you. It will always buy foreign exchange and sell it back to you at the fixed rate of exchange. I guess there's a little spread in there, but that's no big deal. Now this is not just a promise, this is a legal imperative, right? If you have a currency board, you have a law that says that the currency board is obliged to buy and sell foreign currency from anybody who wants to buy or sell it at that fixed rate, fixed rate of exchange. And what that means is that the supply of base money depends solely on the supply and demand for foreign exchange. In other words, it depends on the balance of payments. The currency board doesn't have any discretion. It is obliged to buy foreign exchange when there's an excess of it in the foreign exchange market. It's obliged to sell it when there's an excess demand for it. The important thing to realise here is that a currency board can never run out of foreign exchange reserves. It can never run out of foreign exchange reserves. I'm emphasising this because most people who talk about currency boards, especially back then in 1998, do not understand this point. Let me just go back to that balance sheet. Look at the amount of base money in existence. It's less than the amount of foreign exchange reserves. So the obligation of the currency board is to sell foreign exchange to people if they come to it and give them base money. But it's only base money. If you want to buy foreign exchange, you have to have base money. And basically, that's the amount of notes and coin in circulation. So, because the amount of foreign exchange reserves is bigger than the amount of base money, the currency board can never run out of foreign exchange reserves. And for that reason, there is no point in speculating against the currency, because the currency board is just going to sit there and say, okay, you want to buy dollars from me, I'll sell it to you at the same rate, but you will run out of base money before I will run out of foreign exchange reserves. So it's very important to understand that. This is a quotation from the Financial Times, a world-famous financial business newspaper in English, and they did not understand this point. This is what they said. Optimists, this was about Indonesia, optimists widely assume that the currency board will be protected from speculative attack because the central board's hard currency reserves, which would have become the currency board's reserves, was about $19 billion US, and that was triple the value of base money at that time at current exchange rates. The Financial Times said this is nonsense. Notes and coins are only a tiny fraction of the total money supply. But this totally missed the point, because you can't use bank deposits to buy currency from the currency board. You can only use base money. So this quote from the Financial Times and lots of other alleged experts at the time, it's just wrong. The only thing that matters is how much foreign reserves are there, how much base money is there at that time. So, around about, I think it was very late in January of 1997, Suharto makes the announcement, problem solved, we're going to set up a currency board. Well, the interesting thing that we find at that time was that the markets loved this idea. And as a result of that, the markets thought, oh, the exchange rate has depreciated too far, it's going to appreciate in the future. And so they started buying rupiah again. And there was a fantastic appreciation of the rupiah, 93% in just about 2 weeks. This is what it looked like. This is about here. This little band here was the time when the currency board proposal was being discussed and became public knowledge. So the rupiah had plunged to about over 14,000 to the dollar, and suddenly it goes way back here to about 7,000, 7,500 to the dollar. So the markets, the investors, both in Indonesia and overseas, they love this idea. They thought, yes, this is a solution to the problem. It's worked in other countries, why shouldn't it work in Indonesia? To me, that very strong appreciation of the rupiah at that time suggests that the currency board proposal should have been taken seriously. People should have tried to learn, well, exactly what is a currency board? How should we make the transition from a central bank to a currency board? Let us accept the fact that the currency board proposal has been successful in some other countries that were also facing a currency crisis. But we didn't see that happen. Instead, even though the private markets, the private sector had thought this is a great idea, the policy establishment, the authorities here, the IMF, the World Bank, even foreign governments, the response to this was intensely negative. And I think this is, looking back, it's astounding. Why would people have such a negative response to this proposal when A, they didn't really understand it, and B, it had been successful elsewhere? Why were they not even willing to consider this proposal on its merits? Here's a couple of quotes. There was a journal that was very popular at that time, the Far Eastern Economic Review, and some months later there was an article there which looked back on what had happened at this time, and they referred to the counterattack to Suharto's embrace of the currency board idea. The counterattack was swift and massive, leaning more to blackmail and name-calling than reasoned disagreement. Mr. Kambasu from the IMF, he threatened to withdraw the IMF rescue package. Major news outfits took to referring to Mr. Hankey, Professor Hankey, as obscure. And it all reached fever pitch when Paul Krugman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist in America, attacked Hankey as a snake oil salesman, like a dukun perhaps, or something like that. Here's another quote that comes from Dow Jones International. This is also about a month or two after the proposal was dropped. It said, at that time, Krugman was reported to have said, I wish I could say the currency boards are really a stupid thing. They're not. They're just a way of preventing governments from printing money. And that, of course, was exactly what Indonesia needed. As you remember, at that time, in January of 1998, Bank Indonesia was increasing the supply of base money so rapidly, and continued to do so, that the supply of money doubled in the space of 8 months. So what we needed, if Bank Indonesia couldn't do it, was a new institution that would stop governments or the central bank from printing money. That's exactly what a currency board would have done. And yet, Krugman was one of the people who was very strongly opposed to the currency board. So why was there such a strong opposition to this currency board? Some people believed that a currency board would actually make the crisis worse. Some people suspected that this was just a plan to allow Suharto to rip off Indonesia for one last time before he was pushed out of office. But I think actually it was a fear of success. I think a lot of people felt if this currency board proposal goes ahead and it succeeds, then we lose our big stick to beat up Suharto. At the moment, we can beat him up. We've been forcing him to change his policies and so on. But if this currency board proposal succeeds, then presumably Suharto will still be in place and all of his other policies will still be in place. So I think by that time, an awful lot of people were thinking this Asian financial crisis is a golden opportunity either to get rid of Suharto or at least to get rid of a lot of these very bad policies. So I think there's a lot of evidence for this last explanation. People actually feared that the currency board would succeed and therefore Suharto would stay in position and continue to do what he had done in the past. As I've said, currency boards have been successful elsewhere, and in 1997, with support from the IMF, Bulgaria and Bosnia and Herzegovina, that's one country, they had implemented currency boards and they were successful. And it's interesting to note that IMF later gave support to currency board proposals for both Russia and Brazil, although these two didn't eventually go ahead. If you look back at statements from some of the top economists in the world at that time, there was actually quite considerable intellectual support for the currency board proposal. Let me mention some big names. I think nearly all of these are actually Nobel Prize winners in economics. It's Gary Becker, Rüdiger Dornbusch, Milton Friedman, Merton Miller, Robert Mundell. I think they're all Nobel Prize winners. They all actually lent support to the currency board proposal. They didn't make a lot of noise and they weren't reported very much, but they are on record as giving support at the time. Another guy was Sir Alan Walters, who was a bureaucrat who had actually played a big role in establishing Hong Kong's currency board in 1983. He was an advisor to Margaret Thatcher in the United Kingdom. So this is a collection of quotations from various key players or observers around at that time, or actually later on. Michel Cambusu said, "We created the conditions that obliged President Suharto to leave his job. The suggestion is we use the opportunity to get rid of Suharto." Paul Keating, my own former Prime Minister of Australia, he is on record as saying, "The United States Treasury quite deliberately used the economic collapse as a means of bringing about the ouster of President Suharto," in other words, Suharto out of office. Lawrence Eagleburger, former US Secretary of State, was later to say, "We were fairly clever in that we supported the IMF as it overthrew Suharto." So the name of the game was not fixing the crisis. The name of the game became getting rid of Suharto, or at least getting rid of his policies. And finally, Merton Miller. There was a feeling at the time that Suharto was just another corrupt dictator like Ferdinand Marcos of the Philippines, and we had to get rid of him. So all of these guys are really suggesting pretty strongly the name of the game then was not to fix the crisis, but to use the crisis as an opportunity to get rid of Suharto. Other people, as I've mentioned, saw the proposal as a scheme to save Suharto rather than save Indonesia. So this is just a quote from a journalist in the Boston Globe. A selfish scheme engineered by Suharto's children and friends to save their fortunes by cashing in rupiah at an inflated exchange rate so they could pay off their dollar debts. In my view, it would have been completely out of character for Suharto to take the money and run. I do not believe for one moment that that was his intention. He, as I said before, regardless of all the bad things he did, there's no doubt about that, he always tried to make the economy grow as rapidly as he could. And he also always did so by making sure that his family and his cronies invested in Indonesia's future by investing in enterprise in the country. In any case, the logic of the currency board is that he could not have got cheap dollars. Because remember, you need base money to buy foreign exchange. And this story also begs the question of what would have been the exchange rate. Because we had a proposal for a currency board, but in fact we didn't know what the exchange rate would have been under the currency board. And as a matter of historical record, Steve Hankey made no recommendation for what the currency board exchange rate should be. On the contrary, this is what he has said subsequently. Going into one of these arrangements, the thing you cannot do is to go with an overvaluation of the currency. And that's precisely what all these critics of Suharto were implying. We want to feel comfortable that the currency is priced appropriately, not overvalued and not dramatically undervalued. Later on, he was to say, I think the best thing to do is to announce you are going to adopt a currency board. That's one announcement, but it doesn't involve saying what the exchange rate was leaving. So the first thing you do is to let the currency float for 30 days, for about a month, and then you lock in the exchange rate that emerges from the market at the end of that period. Remember that he was instrumental in setting up a currency board in Bulgaria in 1997. He says that's exactly what we did in 1997 in Bulgaria. It worked very well, and I think that's probably what they should do in Indonesia. So a lot of people think incorrectly that Hankey not only said we should have a currency board, but that he suggested what the exchange rate would be. He used a figure of 5,000 or 5,500 just for illustrative purposes, just an example. But in fact, this was his line of reasoning. You let the market decide what the exchange rate should be. So if you adopt that approach, you announce we're going to have a currency board, and then you allow the rupiah to float in the market. And during that 1 month period of transition, the central bank, which is still there, it has to stay out of both the foreign exchange market and the money market. Now the implication of that is that international reserves at the beginning of that 1 month period will still be the same at the end of that 1 month period, because the central bank is committed not to engage in money market transactions. It's a very important thing to realise that. So any trading that goes on in foreign exchange during that 1 month period is between different private sector players. I can buy from Asset, but I cannot buy from Bank Indonesia. Right? So we've got a true market mechanism without any interference from the central bank, and so the exchange rate that emerges during that period reflects the consensus of the market, what the rupiah should be at the end of that period. Now you're going to get a lot of fluctuations in the beginning of that period, no problem, but by the end of the period, things will settle down and people will come to that consensus view. But in trying to decide, trying to guess what the future exchange rate will be, players in the market will be guided by the current volume of reserves. Remember, it was about $19 billion, let's say $20 billion, an Australian number, and base money. Because remember, the currency board that emerges at the end of this has to have an amount of foreign exchange reserves which is a little bit more than the amount of base money. Well, we know both of those numbers right now. We know how much international reserves there are. It's about $20 billion. And we know how much base money there is, because that's the monetary liabilities of Bank Indonesia. You read it from Bank Indonesia's balance sheet. It was roughly 60 trillion rupiah. So if 60 trillion rupiah is roughly equal to $20 billion, then the exchange rate should be about 3,000 rupiah per dollar. So I'm not saying that's what would have been the exchange rate if we had set up a currency board, but people are going to sort of be looking at those two numbers, and that's the sort of guess they're going to be making. So if you decide to buy or sell at 3,000 on the first day and nobody wants to trade with you, then the second day it'll have to be different, and eventually you'll find it equilibrium. So as I say, on that basis, the suggested currency board rate would have been about 3,000 per US dollar. And that's kind of like what it was at the end of December 1997. The irony of the fact that Suharto gave up on the currency board idea is that the bad things that people predicted, if you had a currency board, actually still happened, and worse, by sticking with the central bank. If you had had a currency board, then that would have precluded Suharto, would have prevented Suharto and his cronies and first family, would have prevented them from looting Indonesia's international reserves. Because during that period of floating, nobody gets to buy from the central bank. You can only buy reserves from other players in the market, including Suharto. So foreign exchange could only have been purchased from other market players during that transition period. But Suharto was bluffed by the IMF, the US government, European governments and so on, the World Bank, the IMF. He was bluffed into keeping the central bank. And the effect of that was precisely to allow Suharto and his cronies to loot the treasury, to steal all those international reserves from the treasury. They didn't do so directly, but they did it via the commercial banks. How did that happen? Well, first of all, remember I mentioned that the strange thing is that in the middle of this crisis, when you would expect banks to be sort of closing down their operations, the banks actually started lending. Some of the state banks and some of the big private banks were making very big rupiah loans, and they were lending to their own conglomerates. We all know that the banks are all owned by conglomerates or by the state. The state banks had close relationships with the conglomerates. So at that time, from the beginning of 1998, all of these commercial banks were making big rupiah loans. And those rupiah loans were then used to speculate against the rupiah. The conglomerates would take that new rupiah loan that they had, and they would go to the central bank and say, I would like some foreign exchange, please. So they used that lending to speculate against the rupiah. They were purchasing foreign exchange from Bank Indonesia. Remember, that couldn't have happened if we adopted a currency. Now, it's pretty obvious that those borrowers, the conglomerates, had no real intention to repay those loans that they had made to themselves. And so the banks went broke. Not just the private banks, but the state banks. They all went broke during this period because they had made very big rupiah loans, and the people to whom they had made those loans were simply not repaying them. And so then, remember what happened? The government, in order to protect those banks' depositors, the government took over all of those failed banks and recapitalised its own state banks. Now, the final step in the argument is that Indonesia has a highly corrupt and highly incompetent legal system. And this corrupt legal system and corrupt bureaucracy allowed the defaulters to escape repayment. Okay? Imagine this, you're a government, Ministry of Finance, you've taken over one of these banks. It doesn't really matter if it's a big private bank or a failed state bank. You go in there, you're now managing that bank, and you look at all the assets and you say, there's a whole lot of loans that haven't been repaid. So you go and ask the borrowers to repay these loans, and the borrower says, oh, sorry, but cannot buy. And then you say, well, if you don't repay them, I'll have to take you to court. I'll have to send you bankrupt. I'll take you to court. So the borrower says, okay, all right. Right? And then you take them to court, and then the borrower goes to the judge. He says, oh, ada masalah ini. This government is trying to get money back from me. Can you help me out? Make a little payment. Maybe you make a big payment under the desk. And the judge says, oh no, this guy doesn't have to be paid. It's okay. So it never happens. So what happens? The government is left owning the bank. The bank is left with a whole lot of bad debts. And the government has to pay for this. And you remember these banks have borrowed a whole lot from Bank Indonesia, but they're not going to repay Bank Indonesia. So indirectly, there has been theft on a grand scale. The firms that borrowed the money from their own banks, which borrowed the money from Bank Indonesia, they've got the money, the government has got the bad debts. So remember, this was exactly what people thought would happen under a currency board. Suharto would loot the currency board, which he couldn't have done actually. So we kill off the currency board idea, and Suharto and his cronies looted the banking system instead. So that's the irony of the situation. If Indonesia had gone with the currency board, all of this would have been prevented. But Suharto allowed himself to be bluffed. He allowed himself to be bluffed by the IMF, by Bill Clinton, by the World Bank, and so on. But the feared outcomes that people had used to argue against the currency board were actually precisely the outcomes that came to pass. And as a result of all of this, as we recall, GDP fell by 13% in 1998. If you look at the quarter-on-quarter rate of decline of GDP to December quarter in 1998, it was actually bigger than that. It was 18% decline. And there were enormous wealth transfers, whereas people have estimated the wealth transfers at that time at about $50 billion US, which was about 40 or 50% of GDP at the time. And that was a transfer from the general public to the conglomerates, basically, and the mechanism was these borrower defaults. Now, in my view, BI should have realised what was happening at that time, but I think BI doesn't even recognise what happened then, even now, 17 years later. It should have known that the banks were lending in the middle of a crisis, and it should have known that those loans ultimately were being used to speculate against the rupiah. You must know this as a central bank because they're buying the rupiah from you. And as regulator of the bank, you must know that the banks are lending. You know that this is happening because the banks are turning to you for liquidity, BLVE, Bantuan Likuiditas Bank Indonesia. You're the central bank. You're the guy that's doing that thing. So to me, I've presented here a little case study of really bad monetary policy in the case of Indonesia in 1998, 1998. And as it turns out, this case study is a really good basis for suggesting that giving a lot of the discretion to the monetary authority is not a good idea. It can be very dangerous. So, at the very least, although Indonesia does not have a currency board, and I'm not really advocating now that it should have a currency board, I think it would be fine if it did happen, but I'm not really here to advocate that. But as long as we still have a central bank, then that central bank needs to understand these things. It needs to understand that it must have only one nominal anchor for monetary policy. It needs to understand that the reason things got so bad in 1998 is precisely because Bank Indonesia did not have a single nominal anchor at that time. It needs to understand that there is a conflict between trying to manage the exchange rate and trying to control inflation. The central bank cannot have two nominal anchors, only one. If it has one, and if it sticks to it, it will create stability at the macroeconomic level. And that's the end of the story. Thank you.